So what is psychic self-defense, and do we really need it? I have to say, if you had talked to me maybe 20, 25 years ago, I would have said, no, we don't really need it. But I learned the hard way, yes. Once you become a spiritual teacher, you learn all about psychic self-defense. So what is psychic self-defense? Psychic, of course, means of the soul, and therefore psychic self-defense means in defense of the soul. There are many books on the subject. Some of the more famous ones are by Dion Fortune, Robert Bruce, and William Bloom. I'm not sure whether any of these are in the library, but William Bloom is definitely one to look out for. I like his work quite a bit. And as I mentioned, this talk is based on my personal experience. I was not a believer and had to learn the hard way. So I want to talk to you about what I consider to be an important tool in psychic and spiritual development, and that is the idea of provisional beliefs. So a provisional belief is one that you accept temporarily on an as-if basis, as if it were true, just to see if it works for you. It's a lot easier to do that and accept or reject it after you've gathered some evidence than it is to look for proof of whether you're going to be able to believe something. And so, especially with respect to psychic self-defense, I think that the idea of provisional beliefs is very important. What I'll be doing in a few slides is presenting what I consider to be my personal worldview, and I'm inviting you to consider it as a set of provisional beliefs that could perhaps be useful for you. So the definition of a provisional belief is that it's not yet a part of your worldview. What I do is I offer it as something for you to consider, and you can adopt it experimentally or provisionally to see whether it works or fits in with your experience. And if it's found useful, these provisional beliefs can become part of your worldview. Our minds and our scientific training when we're younger tend to go in the direction of having things to be proven to us before we accept them. And as a result, there's a lot of confusion about psychic and spiritual experience. And I find that this provisional belief approach is really a good one for getting used to an idea and seeing whether it explains the inner and outer experience, and then eventually just living your way into it instead of trying to get rid of old beliefs and replacing them with new ones. The caveat is that when you're looking for proof, you end up gathering equal amounts of evidence on both sides of the question. And I think this is true in every area of life. So now, my worldview. We live in a universe based on the principle of learning and growth, also called physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual evolution. The goal of evolution is to return to oneness with our divine source, having fully realized all our latent physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual powers. The method of growth is by initiation. A challenge is laid down and remains in force until all powers required to recognize, engage with, and overcome it have been successfully realized. The reason initiation was in red before is that's a word I'll come back to later. We are now a step closer to Source when we've overcome one of these challenges. We often will experience a profound sense of joy or bliss, and we have new, more expansive duties in service of those who are behind or below us in their journey back to Source. We also have new, more difficult initiatory challenges to overcome. And my belief is that the very structure of our universe is initiatory. Some of you, if you dig around on the internet, will find that I taught a series of sessions on initiation at the International Theosophical Center in Naarden, the Netherlands. And I taught in English, but it was recorded, and I believe they've put it up on their website there. So if you want to know more about the idea of initiation, you can look into that material. So one thing that we have to consider are other beings and our relationships with them. And whenever you read into parapsychology and the idea of psychic self-defense, you will encounter this word entity. And people love saying the word. It sounds official somehow. I believe it has some problems associated with it, which is one of the reasons why I put it in quotation marks. We are helped or hindered in overcoming initiatory challenges by other beings, entities, who are above, at, or below our developmental level. We must learn to attract or be drawn to such help, recognize and trust it, let it into our outer and inner lives, and allow it to guide us. We must also learn how to identify and protect ourselves from unhelpful beings. And versions of unhelpfulness include untrustworthiness, beings who are falsely attractive or hypnotizing us, so to speak, with glamour, possibly harmful or dangerous to the integrity of our inner or outer life. Their attempts to distract us from or thwart our evolutionary progress must be rejected, defended against, or repelled/expelled. The difference between those words is repelled means that you've managed to banish it before it got into you. Expelled means that something may have gotten into your aura or into your physical body. So the human aura I just mentioned is really our safeguard against these things, but also our point of vulnerability. We are equipped with etheric, emotional, mental, and spiritual bodies endowed with powers that protect us against unhelpful, potentially harmful beings. These bodies exist as energetic envelopes or layers surrounding the physical body. Collectively, these layers are called the human aura. Basic layers of the aura that are also our subtle bodies include the etheric body layer. I usually think of that as going out to about 9 inches from the surface of our skin. The astral or emotional body layer, which is 9 to 18 inches out. The mental body layer, 18 to 36 inches out. And the causal or soul body layer, 3 to 5 feet out. And in some cases, for more advanced souls, there's access to a Buddhic body layer that is out beyond 5 feet and seems not to have a limit. So psychic self-defense means learning to make use of our powers to discern helpful beings from unhelpful ones, in the same way our physical immune system learns to recognize helpful bacteria and repel harmful bacteria and viruses. It's hard to know whether viruses are helpful, so I had to word that very carefully. But we all know about helpful gut bacteria, for example. The aura is our spiritual immune system. Now, every encounter with other beings, physical or non-physical, human or non-human, above, equal to, or below our level of development, is a test of the integrity of our spiritual immune system. It's also an initiatory challenge on our journey back to Source. What doesn't kill us makes us stronger. Some of you will know that from the Dune books. But it actually has its origin in Nietzsche. And it is very true with respect to psychic self-defense. The good thing is, most of the stuff we have to defend ourselves from psychically is not going to kill us, but it definitely makes us stronger. So what is an initiatory challenge? I believe these are tests of what we do and do not know about ourselves at the present stage of our journey back to Source. They take place within our inner and outer worlds. They often involve encounters with unfamiliar situations and beings. And they are requiring appropriate development and use of our physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual powers. So with respect to an initiatory challenge, we have a number of choices. We can step across the threshold and behave appropriately. We can meet the challenge. Often, if we do that with a great deal of confidence, we are self-remembering something that we knew about the situation, either from the past of this lifetime or the past of some other lifetime in which we had already mastered it, and we're just bringing it into our consciousness in the present lifetime. Another choice is stepping across the threshold and then stepping back, which is an indication that you're not quite ready to take on that challenge. A third choice is stepping up to the threshold and considering before stepping across. In other words, preparing, gathering information. And then finally, there's turning away from the threshold, which could be interpreted as resisting or rejecting your growth, the next step in your growth. When properly completed, we leave an initiatory challenge behind. And we are wiser, more skilled, perhaps more joyful, and hopefully ready to embrace the next one. I had to put the word perhaps in front of joyful because not everybody likes this idea that we live in a universe of initiations. They might prefer something a little more comfortable. But I like to remind people that boredom and comfort often go hand in hand together, and no adventure is ever really comfortable. And certainly initiatory challenges are inner and outer adventures. When an initiatory challenge is left incomplete, it tends to recur until we've extracted every ounce of learning from it. You could call that growth on the installment plan. And this is important to understand. This growth can be organic and unhurried. There can be pauses as we wait for missing pieces of information to fall into place. And we can ask or pray to whoever's on duty to slow things down so we're not overwhelmed. My friend Fran, who's a psychotherapist and deeply practicing Buddhist, uses this phrase that she prays to whoever's on duty. She doesn't address the prayer to anybody in particular. She just assumes somebody's going to hear it and take care of it, and the name doesn't matter that much. When an initiatory challenge is resisted, the whole mechanism of what I call the grace machine, also called karma, moves to turn people back towards Source. That experience of being in touch with Source does certainly bring joy, and that's one of the reasons why I call it the grace machine. And I'm using this currently as a way of getting away from the word karma, which I think has become too polarized into the idea of good karma and bad karma, or earning good karma, earning merit, and trying to avoid creating bad karma, or even trying to expiate bad karma. My feeling is whatever we did, it was done out of ignorance. However, we live in a universe based on the principle of growth. The Source has pushed us out of itself to go on this journey and is inviting us to return to oneness with it. And that's a joyful process if we participate with it. And grace is what happens when, through our ignorance, we've ended up straying somehow or going against any of the laws of the universe. And the way the grace machine works is often gently, but with increasing firmness and pressure if we don't listen. And it's usually scaled to the intensity of our resistance until the challenge is accepted and successfully met. I think we've all had that experience where no matter how hard we try to avoid a certain situation or a certain person, that person or situation tends to show up in our lives over and over again until eventually we deal with it. And if they don't show up in our waking life, they'll show up in our dreaming life, letting us know there's something incomplete. Now, here's where we start to transition into identifying the word entities as problematic. What I call agents of the grace machine are the spiritual teachers that work with us, with or without our knowledge, to turn us back towards Source. And they're often misidentified as negative entities, the reason being that they seem to go against our will. And this is a very important thing to understand about psychic self-defense. If we really want to do something and our soul or some other level of our being or some other being who's involved with teaching us doesn't want us to do it, all of a sudden they are evil in our minds, and we ignore them and do everything we can to avoid any kind of contact with them. So one of the greatest tasks in psychic self-defense is to know the difference between the wrathful teachers and the compassionate ones. Those are terms borrowed from Tibetan Buddhism, from the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Once you've passed on, you're invited to join the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas by the manifestation of loving, compassionate deities who are supporting you in making that choice. The problem is they're so far above and so intense that they scare you to death, so you run. Well, just in case you're still somehow amenable to joining the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, the next round is an encounter with the wrathful deities, and these are hopefully going to scare you into taking refuge with the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas. However, most people will run away from them too. There's really not much difference between the compassionate deities and the wrathful deities. It's just that the wrathful deities are a lot louder. Now, what happens in the Tibetan Book of the Dead is if you keep running like that, you'll go into the one safe place there is, seemingly safe, and that's a womb, preparing you for rebirth. So the reason that we have this problem with agents of the grace machine is that they seem to be stronger than we are, and that often terrifies us. They seem to thwart our will, as I mentioned, and we often don't like the experiences that they're shepherding us into, even if they're good for us. We don't understand how such experiences might be necessary for our growth, and that may only really mean that we don't know how to learn from them, which I used the word ignorance early. That's essentially what I meant, that we don't know how to learn from the initiatory challenges that are placed in front of us. So now, let's get down to the nitty-gritty about entities as a problematic term. It's constantly used in the sense of beings who are different from us. We could call somebody who speaks another language an entity. We generally don't, but what's the difference between calling someone physical and calling someone non-physical an entity? The non-physicals may be very helpful, and we're simply having difficulties understanding their differences from us, and that scares us. And as a result, we are calling them entities instead of welcoming them as potential teachers. So the word entities also emphasizes differences rather than similarities or sameness. My idea of an entity is that it's a container of something. There's a self inside a container. And that the person who uses that word is trying to affirm that their container is strong enough that the being outside of them, that it can't get in somehow. The unfortunate thing is, I'll point out in another slide, is that any kind of interaction or communication with non-physical beings requires that there be some permeability of our boundaries. So, entities, again, promote separateness rather than the idea of kinship, and it tends to be polarized by our likes and dislikes. So, for example, you'll see the phrases in books that use the word entities, podcasts, and so on, positive and negative, and this sort of familiar slang term, negs, which sounds very cool, I suppose, but, it's pejorative in the same way that we might say pejorative things about someone from another country. So, fear-based, that's the problem with the word entities. All entities are assumed to be threats to our self-boundaries, our autonomy, our personal agency, our integrity, and in some cases, our actual existence. And, the problem is we never ask them. Once you use the word entity, if you're afraid at any of these levels, you're not going to ask what the entity is or why it's there or what it may be able to do for you, if anything, or you may not be able to discern the difference between a harmful and a helpful one. But the problem with the word entities is it makes the assumption that all other beings separate from yourself are in some way a threat. Now, as I mentioned, identification, interaction, and communication with other beings requires energy field contact or low intensity, energy fields rubbing against each other, so to speak. That provides a very basic amount of information about who you are versus someone else, whether you like them or don't like them, for example. And the same thing can be true of working with non-physical beings. If you're going to have a deeper interaction, then energy field overlap where the boundaries are actually interpenetrating each other becomes what you experience. That's a kind of medium level intensity. And at that point, it's not exactly what would be called a mind meld, but there is a kind of sharing of information. And obviously you have to feel very safe and secure in yourself before you can allow something like that to happen. Supposedly we practice this in our love relationships. The idea of constantly being with someone with energy field contact just by living with them, hopefully that doesn't strengthen our self-boundary so much that we're actually just two people living next to each other. Hopefully at some point there's an energy overlap and then a feeling of mutual support develops from that. The same thing can happen with non-physical beings when they're the right sort. And there can also be a temporary merging of energy fields, a more high-intensity experience. Not a possession, but this is actually a form of communication. So one of the stories I can tell about my experience of that was I felt like I was swimming in an ocean, but it was an ocean of consciousness. This happened at night. And I was aware of being in the presence, the near presence of two beings. And as I approached them, I realized that this ocean of consciousness that I was in was the shared energy field of their communication with each other. And the problem for me was it was more love than I'd ever experienced in any other situation, physical or non-physical, just completely overwhelming. And I kind of swam up to the surface to get out of that because it was so overwhelming, and then could see that it was just that these two non-physical beings were talking to each other. And that was more love than I'd ever personally experienced. So there are lots of teachings that develop like that when you start understanding that we can't think of other beings as entities in the sense of having to protect ourselves from them. Source is love, so anytime you're getting closer to Source, you can guarantee that what you're experiencing is going to be of the nature of the experience I just described to you. To be anything but terrifying, each of these experiences requires a higher degree of true self-knowledge than what we may have at a particular moment. And true self-knowledge has to do with what we were created to do and be. The more of that we know about ourselves, the more secure we are against any form of being taken over by some other being. And terror means that we do not yet have such knowledge. Now the next slide is the beginning of a poem by the Austrian Bohemian poet Rainer Maria Rilke. It's the opening of his first Duino elegy, which perfectly describes what I was talking about here. It's all in a block because I couldn't make it into lines, and it's my own translation from the German. If I cried out, who among the angelic orders would hear me? And if one did, and suddenly pressed me against its breast, wouldn't I be consumed in its greatness of being? For what is beauty but the barely endurable beginning of terror, bewildering us as it serenely disdains our destruction? Every angel is terrifying. Now the angels are very much higher than we are, and that's one of the reasons why this invocation of sorts to an angel, to an inspiring angel, is such a good way of demonstrating what is meant by the idea of being overlapped or overlapping another being for the sake of communication, in this case for the sake of artistic inspiration. And I love this, that if we can stay in the part where it feels beautiful, we'll be thrilled and it'll feel dangerous, but it won't be so terrifying that we're consumed. We have to learn how to make that distinction. So, in my understanding and in my experience, in my work with my classes, in the kinds of things that have happened to me when I've been exploring other realms in my sleep, I've learned that there are only a few potentially negative, quote-unquote, entities. And I italicize the word potentially because under most conditions, entities are not dangerous unless we are vulnerable in some way. There's something inside us that has drawn them to us. So the types of potentially negative entities are intentionally or unintentionally harmful thought forms and the messengers behind them. This is a topic that I covered extensively in the lecture that I gave and the workshop that I did last year. I'm pretty sure that the lecture is findable on the YouTube channel for the Theosophical Society in America. An intentionally harmful thought form is you really hate someone, and that goes out to them and can have an effect on them, and is the basis for something called the evil eye in Western European folk belief. An unintentionally harmful thought form is what happens when we cling to people. We may love them and we may want to be loved by them, but when we cling to them, we're sending them a thought that is binding them to us in some way, and that can be potentially harmful for them. And I capitalize the word messengers for a couple of reasons. One is the actual meaning of the Greek word angeloi is messenger. And the angels in Theosophical thinking are a part of an evolution called the Deva evolution that runs parallel to our human evolution. And one level of this Deva evolution are the beings that I call messengers that carry these thought forms. The beings themselves are completely neutral. They don't care whether the thought they're carrying is intentionally or unintentionally harmful or that it's beneficial in some way. And we need to know how to deal with these messengers. The next potentially negative entity has to do with the recently dead who may be attempting to purge their unexpressed negative emotions and unfulfilled desires through us. This is something that I personally experienced, and it's not a pleasant experience. It was a good learning experience. In a way, it's helpful for the dead because it helps them move through the astral levels of the afterlife, which are often likened to the old Catholic belief in purgatory. And it used to be that Catholics were taught to pray for souls to help move them through purgatory. And the basis of that is that this allows some of this energy that they're carrying with them that was unexpressed to be channeled back into physical reality in the same way that lightning can be channeled through a lightning rod into the earth and doesn't burn the house down. If you know what you're doing, you can be that kind of lightning rod for people. And if you know what it is, if you're unintentionally doing it, you can shut it down. And then finally, dark magicians who are seeking power over us. I'm capitulating to the word dark. I don't necessarily want to use the word evil. I also don't want to use the word black. Everybody seems to be gravitating towards the word dark. Sometimes people like it for dark fantasy and terms like that, different genres of fictional literature. But there is a differentiation of sorts between the kinds of spiritual beings who support us in our growth and the ones who are trying to limit or control us. And everybody knows what I mean when I use the phrase dark magician. They do exist, but they also exist in a form called reformed or reforming dark magicians, which is not something you'll read about very often, because one of the tasks of the reformed dark magicians is to scare us back onto the path back to source. That's how they atone for the ways that they may have taken advantage of us in previous lifetimes. And then finally, the forces or beings of chaos or unmaking. In some sources, these are called the Qliphoth, and that's a term that comes from the Kabbalah. There's a sort of popular form of dark magic, I consider it dark magic, called chaos magic, that specifically addresses these entities. The good thing about them is if you don't invoke them, you'll probably never meet up with them or deal with them in any way. So the very quickest way to protect yourself psychically from them is don't read those books, don't try those spells, don't light those candles, that kind of thing. The people who are doing that are making wonderful experiments on behalf of humanity, which I hope they survive. And even if they don't, we can learn something from it. All other so-called negs are positive or neutral, quote-unquote, entities that we're not yet ready to interact with. We're scared because we feel their desire to communicate with us, and we are afraid because we think that they're trying to invade us, when really there just needs to be a little overlap in our auras. So finally, after all of this about entities, let's just call them beings. So from this point on, beings, not entities. So what types of beings are we talking about here? Basic classification, you can have physical beings, you can have non-physical beings. You can have human beings and non-human beings. Then you can have various combinations of these. Physical humans, such as other people, related or unrelated to us, of many different types. You could have physical and non-human. Animals, I put maybe cryptids and exobeings. I have a friend who loves to dabble in those things. If they're physical, I don't know because I haven't experienced any of them, then we need to deal with them in the same way that we would deal with a dangerous animal, which is don't go where they are. Of course, the people are trying to prove whether they exist or not, and are often gathering evidence on both sides of that question, are out there looking for them, and they're also experimenting on for the benefit of humanity, I guess you can say. Non-physical and human, another variety. Ghosts, the dead, invisible helpers, which are people who are alive but working on the astral plane, usually at night, to help people who have passed on, or sometimes people in the physical world. And the masters or the Mahatmas that are involved with higher spiritual teachings. And you can also have non-physical and non-human beings, the Deva evolution that I was talking about, which includes nature spirits, fairies, and angels. Now, there are in the initiatory challenges that I talked about, there are basic tests of your ability to discern the difference between these levels. And one thing that you'll constantly read about in Theosophical literature is watch out for the nature spirits, because they're said to be untrustworthy, they'll try to trick you. And my view, based on the idea of a spiritual immune system, is if they trick us, we're trickable, and we need to know that. And we're trickable for a reason, and we need to eliminate that. And when we've eliminated that, we've strengthened our spiritual immune system. And then we realized they were just playing a joke, because they saw that in our aura we would have some big reaction that was fun for them to see. Completely harmless if we don't think of them as entities. Then there are different levels of beings. Again, these are questions of discernment. Some are lower in development than we are, or behind us in development. These can be misleading, distracting, seductive, or annoying, but only to the extent that we're trickable by any of those means. Then there are those who are equal in development to our level. These may not always be trustworthy. What I mean by this are human beings on the physical plane, the ones that we trust, the ones that we don't trust. Any human being or human-seeming being that we encounter in an out-of-body state, we have to pretty much treat in the same way. But we have to be open to the idea that they could be trustworthy, but we can't completely give our trust away, and we can't completely shut ourselves down either. We have to use our inner senses to develop discernment. And then finally, those that are higher in development than we are, who may be terrifying in power and intensity, but can also be really potent teachers, helpful teachers on our spiritual path. For example, in Tibetan Buddhism, the wrathful deities are said to be the ones that help us cut through illusion. And typically they're pictured as having sharp weapons, sharp teeth, lots and lots of arms, skulls that have been ripped off of bodies, hearts that have been ripped out of chests, etc., etc. That imagery is actually, interestingly enough, very shamanic, because those of us who've studied shamanism realize that there is something called the death and dismemberment scenario. It's a form of spirit initiation into shamanism where exactly what I was just talking about happens. You're taken apart, you're put back together, and hopefully you're a better person after that, and you have healing abilities. But the same thing is true of the kinds of meditations that are done in Tibetan Buddhism, where you actually invite these wrathful deities in to help you cut through your illusions, the things that you're clinging to, with your hands or with your heart or with your mind. Then we need to learn how to discern the intentions of other beings. They can be friendly or unfriendly. I want to point out, I often use polarities here because these are the simplest things to discern. A being that's friendly versus one that's unfriendly. One that you can't tell might just be neutral, but that's certainly not unfriendly. Attractive or unattractive. Often with fairies, for example, the attractive ones are the dangerous ones and the unattractive ones are the safe ones. The unattractive ones in all the fairy tales are the ones that are going to grant your wishes, but you have to get over how ugly they are before you ask. The attractive ones are going to get you into trouble. You have to ask yourself whether they're helpful or harmful, whether they're supportive or controlling. I have this mantra, always power under, never power over. And so I try to live that way, and I think it's a useful way also of thinking about how other people or other beings are interacting with you. Are they power under, in which case there's support, and that usually means safety? Are they power over? Are they trying to control you? The tricky ones, the dark magicians, will sometimes pretend to be supporting you from underneath while they're imposing their will over you. Compassionate and wrathful in the way that I was talking about. The compassionate deities are the embracing spiritual teachers, the wrathful ones are the challenging ones. And we need to learn to know that the challenging ones are not necessarily unhelpful, unfriendly, unattractive, and controlling. We need to learn that actually they can be very good for us. And then the neutral or the unknown types. Unknown in this sense, by the way, simply means don't go there. You're not ready for it yet. Some problems of discernment that I've noticed in myself and in others is misidentifying higher beings trying to warn or help us. So, for example, you're in elf territory and the elf doesn't want you to go there. So the elf comes out and tries to scare you away. The elf is only doing what it needed to do in order to make sure you understood you weren't ready to go there, you weren't invited to go there, they didn't want you to go there. And now the elf is an evil elf because it crossed your will. So obviously this can apply to lots of different levels of beings, and again, we can only really discern if our heart is open in some way, because it's the heart chakra that helps us through empathy figure out whether a being is friendly or unfriendly, because we'll feel the heart chakra close. Our mind doesn't decide. We feel the heart chakra close, just as one example. Seemingly attractive or helpful beings seeking to tempt, ensnare, or control us. Communication from friendly beings misunderstood as boundary intrusions. Again, there has to be contact of some kind. They're not trying to possess us. Neutral beings carrying harmful messages, the thought form messengers that I was talking about earlier. And then what are actually negative behaviors? But again, subject to interpretation, hence the quotation marks. Admonition or warnings that we don't want to hear or respect. Again, the elf that I was talking about, or an angel. Because we don't like it, the angel is evil. and then we don't get the help that we need. We have to work on not feeling that way. Destruction. Generally speaking, these are demonstrations of how we're harming ourselves that are reflected back to us. So one example would be drinking, for example. That tends to open up the astral level of being to interaction with other beings and to make it difficult to close the boundaries against them. Now, we might need to know that our boundaries are open. We might need to know that drinking is doing that. We might feel that we're being harmed by these entities, but they're really tests of our immune system. They're just saying, don't do it this way. So I think it's very rare that an entity really, really wants to destroy us. In the same way that some bacteria, don't really want to destroy us. They may need us, and we may need them for mutual support in our digestive tract. A third form of negative behavior is appropriation of our attention, time, energy, and life force. This is pretty much the same kind of thing. We're vulnerable to this kind of appropriation. We're distractible, we're seducible. The idea of spiritual entities, beings coming into our dreams and being seductive and somehow drawing on our life force. There is some truth in that, but once again, it's letting us know that we're vulnerable. We can't discern the difference between a human being who is feeding off of our sexual energy and one that's giving us some kind of thrill or pleasure. A fourth kind of negative behavior, I had to combine all three of these because there wasn't really one word that fully covered the territory. Redirection or control or exploitation. Basically, this is something that narcissists, dark empaths, that's a new psychological term that you might want to look up sometime, and dark magicians are often using the ability to redirect or control or exploit us through love and sexuality, through goodwill or desire to be of service, especially through life purpose, trying to appropriate our life purpose so that we're doing their work either for them or under them to support them in it, but abandoning our own. And in some cases, taking over our agency and threatening our autonomy. And obviously, these are the truly dangerous entities. And then finally, one that you won't really find in other books, I'm using the word entanglement for it. Any form of harmful magic entangles you with the person that you're trying to wound. Any form of promise to another being, physical or non-physical, or a vow that's made, will also entangle you with other beings. Magical invocations and contracts, the same thing. And ultimately, karma is a form of entanglement, especially if you've engaged in the really terrible karmic behaviors of enslavement, torture, and murder. Now, this is important to know about, not just because of the interactions that we have with human beings, but the kind of magic that summons a deva into a magical circle and then tries to enslave that being creates a kind of karma. And my understanding is once we're done having unwound ourselves from all the karma we've ever accumulated with any human being, then we have to do it with all the devas that we entangled ourselves with throughout the lifetimes that we've experienced. Luckily, by that time, we're usually spiritually savvy enough to know what that is and what it means and to be willing to try to do that work. So I'm going to conclude with a daily spiritual practice that I think in and of itself has a lot of potential for protecting us psychically and spiritually. And I have to tell you, I've been teaching psychic and spiritual development for 25 years, and I've been teaching this daily spiritual practice to my groups for maybe the last 5 or 6 years. I don't get why no one gets it. It's like, is it too simple? Is that the problem? my feeling is that they wouldn't come in with all these problems if they just did this. So anyway, show up is the first element of the daily spiritual practice. Showing up with open-minded curiosity. This is essentially the cure for anxiety. People are often so fearful about just showing up and finding out what's there. Well, you know, I have to say, very few things lead to immediate death. Some do, but not everything. And when you're allowing yourself to get wound up with anxiety, it can feel that way. Be fully present, which means no regrets about the past or anxieties about the future. That means really being in the present moment. One of my inner spiritual teachers said, if you live in space and time, there's only ever one next step. That's the only thing that you need to be focused on. Now, our society right now is fragmenting our intention in a million different ways. And so it's difficult to be fully present because we've forgotten how, or maybe we never learned, because our attention has been drawn into laptop and cell phone usage beyond what is actually good for us. I am always riding public transit in Boston, and the problem there is 90% of the people have a cell phone in front of them the whole time they're there, so there's no possibility of meeting or interacting with people. Be kind to yourself and others in thought, feeling, speech, and action. This I drew directly out of Annie Besant. And it's a very theosophical approach to the idea of developing universal brotherhood or universal kinship. It's also probably one of the harder elements of this spiritual practice, because we have to really work especially on being kind to ourselves and others in our thoughts about ourselves and others. And then finally, find a step to take in mutual joy. I put mutual in parentheses because it can be in personal joy, it can be in mutual joy, in joy with others. And the way I think of that is look for a, quote, right best next step. Now, there's always a next step in front of us. There's usually a right next step in front of us. There are many fewer right next steps than next steps. But a right best next step is the one that absolutely is for the greater good of all. And when we find that step, then the joy is at the most intense, whether we're finding it for ourselves or finding it in a mutuality of experience with other people. So I won't ask you if you think that's hard, but my experience is try it as a provisional belief and see how you do with it, and then tell me about it when I'm here next year.